Hello. Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for coming to the seminar presentation today for the Department of Bioengineering. We appreciate you joining us. Today I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Snowdy, who has been working with us in the Department of Bioengineering through the Culture Translational Partnership Program that we have here at the University of Louisville for about the last 3 years. Stephen, is that about right?
13.
Was it 13?
13 years.
Okay, so yeah, about 13 years, it feels like that.
13 or 4. Conversion factor.
But Dr. Snowdy is somebody that's been out in the venture capital world as well as an entrepreneur. He's been involved in a number of different companies. He's currently CEO of AbbeyMed, which is a preclinical cancer therapeutic company. Also CEO of a lens company, Visioneering Technologies, and chairman and CEO of a phase 2 osteoarthritis company. He did his undergraduate degree in chemistry from the University of Florida, and unfortunately, we, University of Louisville, were not very gracious hosts to him yesterday because he did his PhD at the University of North Carolina, so he was not very pleased with the outcome of the game, but we were.
I thought we redacted that.
But today he's going to talk to us about trying to get medical innovations to market and some of the key things to look at. He's got a lot of experience in that area. I have to say, and I think Jessica will say the same thing, it's been truly a pleasure to work with over the last 3 years, and we really enjoy it. And even as things change with the Coulter Foundation, we still want to have him keep on being engaged with us because he's truly a very valuable asset to the program and what we're doing here at the University of Louisville. But without further ado, if you will please join me in welcoming Dr. Snowdy.
I think we have a small enough group here, we can keep it pretty conversational. So if anybody has a question as we go through this, just stop me and let's just talk about it. With a bigger group, I don't think we'd be able to do that, but we should be able to manage that okay. I'm going to walk around a lot. Is that okay? Okay. So is anybody here translating technologies? We have any students or faculty? Rob, let's start with you. Why? Why are you doing that?
Because I like to see the technology be put to good use,
Okay.
and to be utilized by people to help society in one way or another.
Okay. Patients benefit, right? Anybody else translating something, maybe for a different reason? Anybody have? Why else would we do this? Why won't we just invent stuff?
May I ask exactly what do you mean by what is translate?
Translate means to take a technology out of the university setting and put it into a commercial setting. Okay, so let's say somebody invents a drug inside a university. And is that where it ends? Is that where it becomes helpful? Not generally. Generally, we have to take it out into a company. We have to put a lot of money into it, put it through clinical trials in order to be able to sell it. That's called the translation process. Okay, so the reason we do this, there are many. One is the patients, right? If we're in medicine, we want to reduce human suffering and improve quality of life. Okay? That's why we do it. Some of us take the perspective of we want to provide clinical practitioners with new ways of doing things. Maybe not necessarily benefiting patients. It may just be to improve the process. Or maybe it's to make money. Some people do this stuff just, this guy clearly is just trying to make money, right? I don't know why I picked that guy, but he did. So it's a money-making enterprise. So it's another reason for doing things. But bottom line is we all want to help people. And we want to reduce the cost of healthcare so that we can do more of helping people. A question always comes up right at the beginning of the translation process when somebody has invented something that they think is going to be valuable. And the question is it translatable? Should it be translated? Is it something that has enough value that somebody's going to want to put the money that it takes into the project to actually get it into humans. So some of the things that, the questions that we have to answer when we ask the question, is it translatable? Is the science really good? And we're going to go through each one of these in a little bit more detail, but these are the questions that a large company would ask before they put the money into something. These are the questions that investors would ask before they put their money into something. And they're really important. Does it improve outcomes, reduce cost? It's got to do one of those things in order for somebody to put money into it or for somebody to pay for a medical product. Ideally, you do both. You reduce cost and improve outcomes, but at minimum, you have to do one of those. If you're not reducing cost or improving outcomes, why bother, right? Addressable market is large. We're going to talk a lot about what addressable market actually means, but there's got to be a lot of money to be made. If there's not a lot of money to be made, unfortunately, in our medical system, chances of something successfully translating and ultimately helping people, very small. You got to be able to get through the clinical trial if one is required in a reasonable way. Lots of need out there, medical need. But if there's not an efficient way where we can get through a clinical trial and prove that something works for a reasonable amount of money, it's never going to make it to patients. And so if it's not going to make it into patients, why start in the first place? Somebody has to be willing to pay for it, obviously, and we have to be able to protect it in a marketplace. And when I say protectable in a marketplace, that means if I invent something and I start selling it today, I don't want somebody else selling it tomorrow, fighting me on pricing to the point where I don't make any money. I have to be able to make money on it as an investor in order to get excited to do something. Any questions so far? Pretty straightforward. Okay. Let's talk about the science. Something that I think academics hate to hear, but it's just true, is that there's an increasing skepticism in university-based science these days. And this has come from a couple of cases in particular and some research that's been published. And the first time I remember seeing this was probably back in 2006, 2007 or so. There was a study published at the Academy of Orthopedic Surgery that showed that less than a third of abstracts that were at the Academy of Orthopedic Surgery actually went into a paper eventually. And it started people thinking, why is that the case? Why is this science good enough for an abstract, but ultimately never gets published in a peer-reviewed journal? And so people started wondering, is there a problem with academic scientists? And then there were a couple of notable cases where an academic paper failed to get replicated. You know, somebody showed, not true, doesn't work that way. And so there's this increasing skepticism among investors, mostly, and among large companies of what the value of academic data is. So one shouldn't be surprised if they're trying to move something out of an academic setting into a commercial setting, into a company, trying to license it out, trying to get somebody to put $100 million into something. To get it to market, if the first thing that that person asks for is, show me that this can be duplicated by an outside lab. Show me this is real. I'm working in a company right now that it's a drug for cancer. It was developed in an academic setting. It was published in Nature, which is the most prestigious journal we have in the United States, the highest impact journal you can get something into. Beautiful paper, just absolutely gorgeous. One of these papers, it takes you weeks to read it because it's just so dense with implication and information. Take this drug out of the university, and the very first thing the investors wanted to do is duplicate the data that was in that paper. Okay? What's the first step of duplicating data with a drug? Anybody want to take a guess?
Or human trials, or whatever trials you have to do to get it.
It's just animal stuff. In addition to animals. First thing you got to do is make the drug. Well, following the procedure that was published, the company that was formed and its new investors couldn't even make the drug. That's sad. You know, that's just absolutely awful. So they went back to that investigator and said, hey, you know, we're trying to follow your procedure here and we're trying to duplicate your data. Can you help us out? We're having trouble making a drug. We can only make it in about a 2% yield, 2% purity. That's not commercially viable. In your paper, you claimed 100%, so we're just kind of curious what we're doing wrong. And the investigator said, well, we've never made it greater than 2% purity. Wow, really? Because your paper says 100%. Oh, well, a grad student wrote that. Okay, but your name's on it. So maybe we can get in touch with the grad student, figure out, you know, what's going on here. This is one of those, the water is really special at my university things. Ultimately, that lab was asked to send the company their finest sample of this drug. Okay, you're using this stuff in animals all the time. You're sending it out to dozens of collaborators to work in other types of cancer. Why don't you send us your finest sample of this stuff that you've been sending out? So they sent it to the company, and the company started developing assays to test the purity of it, because the lab wasn't even testing the purity of this stuff. They hadn't even developed the chemical assays to do that yet. And it turns out that their finest sample that they were sending out to collaborators all over the world, 2% purity, 98% starting material. It's a really big problem, okay? So this happens over and over again. And so don't be insulted if you're in a university and somebody says, really interesting stuff, first thing I want to do is I want to see an outside, unaffiliated lab duplicate the data, okay? Ultimately, they did find a way to synthesize the drug, but this is a very different asset than it was, you know, when that company first licensed it, when they thought that, you know, this had been proven out already. Any questions? Controls are super, super critical. When we're sitting in an academic setting, we're looking to publish a paper and we're doing science, we think of controls one way. People who are in companies and medical investors think about controls very, very differently. We don't often, or don't always, go into the literature and say, well, that's the control that everybody else is using to test our hypothesis. You need negative controls, you need positive controls. In a company, we view things very differently. If we're going to design an experiment, we want to do it once, and we want to prove definitively at the end of that experiment whether this works or not. And so we're very deliberate about our controls. Sometimes we go to doctors and we say, well, if we're going to tell you something, that something works, what would you want to see it as a control? Sometimes they'll give you another drug and say, well, that's what I used today, so it's got to be better than that. Or I know that this doesn't work at all. Maybe that's what you should use. We'll go to companies, large companies, who ultimately are the buyers of these technologies and say, we want to convince you that we have something that cures brain cancer. What do you want to see as a control? What animal model do you want us to use? And sometimes they come up with stuff that is not in the literature. You know, just things that you wouldn't normally think of as an academic is going to be their level of proof. That's what they're going to want to see. And so it's really important as you think about experiments, when you ultimately want to translate a technology, to talk to as many people as you can. We call those people stakeholders. To find out what are they going to find convincing, because it may not be what in an academic setting we would consider convincing. When you are developing something like a drug or a medical device, it's always really smart, to the extent possible, and it's never perfect, to follow industry standards. And that goes back to the example I gave you of this drug that this lab never even manufactured. The reason they didn't know that they didn't manufacture it is because they didn't do what we call assay development. They didn't want to take the time to figure out, is that drug pure? If so, how pure is it? What do we actually have? In that drug, it has a very characteristic color. And in their reaction, in their synthetic reaction, they were getting this color, so they just assumed they were getting mostly drug. But it turns out if you put a drop of dye in a really large bucket of water, it has a surprising effect on the color, even though there's very little dye. So to the extent possible, when you're developing a medical device or a drug, if you don't know what industry looks for in quality control and quality assurance, find out and implement those procedures right at the get-go. And whether it's a medical device and you're doing design history files, whether it's a drug and you're doing chemical assays to prove you have what you think you have, don't spend 5 years of your life working on something to find out I didn't even have what I thought I started with. Okay, this stuff is super important. Speaking of 5 years of your life, if you're talking about translating medical technologies, my contact lens company, I invested in this company in 2008. We just started selling product this year. I put my heart and soul into that company since 2008. And it's considered a fairly simple medical device. You can only do a few of these in your lifetime. You can only translate a few technologies in your lifetime, whether you're in the IT field, whether you're in a medical field, whether you're in a physics field. Taking a technology and making a product out of it will suck you dry for a solid 6 to 8 to 10 years. And if you don't even start till you're 30 years old or so, maybe a little bit younger, you can only do a few of these in your lifetime. So if something is really goofy about it, if you screw it up at the very beginning, wouldn't you want to know it at the very beginning instead of working on it for 10 years and finding out, oh my God, it was blue, but there was no drug in it. You want to know that early on so that if it's not going to work or if something's wrong, you start on the next one. Because nobody generally wins on their first translation project or your first invention. You have to stay at this for a while to really get it. And so you want to get that first failure out of the way as soon as possible. It doesn't mean that you do it poorly or half-assed. It just means you're really rigorous about how you design your experiments and the level of proof that you should have for yourself that it actually means something. Because most projects in medicine fail. Any questions? Okay. That's the science. The claims. What are you going to say about this thing? Does it cure cancer? Does it do a better job than what's out there today? Is it going to reduce costs but provide the same outcome as what's out there today? Now, these are the claims that you're going to make about your project, and it's really going to guide how attractive it is. If I am sitting in a large company and you come to me and you say, well, we have this new brain cancer drug. It's no better than what's out there, but it's new. It's no cheaper, but it's new. That's not going to carry a lot of value. Okay, it's sort of used to. Back when spinal fusion started to come out, there were a multitude of devices that you could use to fuse the spine when somebody had a degenerating disc. And the reason there were so many is because somebody invented one and made a shit ton of money on it. And then somebody else said, wow, they made a lot of money on that. I think I'll invent one. And it's going to look pretty much the same, but it's going to be different enough that I can get a patent on it. And somebody else did it, somebody else did it. Before you know it, there's 6 companies out there with spinal fusion devices. That worked for a while. It doesn't work anymore. To get a product out now, you got to have a substantial impact on the cost of care or a substantial impact on clinical outcomes. And again, ideally, especially not increasing the cost of care. Who can tell me the percentage of this country's GDP that we spend on healthcare? 20%. Any other guesses? 33. 18. Who said 18? In the back, we have 18, 33, and 20. Any more?
45.
45. This is one of the problems. This is one of the problems in our society is people don't realize what this stuff costs. 17%. We spend 17% of this country's economic output on healthcare. Who can tell me the next country down from us?
Japan.
Nope. I'll give you a hint, wrong part of the world.
China.
Not Asia. We're in Europe.
Germany.
Germany. It's Germany. What do you think they spend?
6%.
6%. Any other guesses? 11. It's 11%. Somebody read the same book I read. Think about the numbers there. 17% versus 11. That's huge. It's trillions of dollars that we spend. So there's a huge focus now on why that's the case. And people are trying to reduce it. The payers are trying to reduce it. It's way too much money, and we don't get benefit out of it. Our healthcare system is no better than any of the ones that are much, much cheaper than ours. So if you come up with a medical product, one thing you damn sure better be able to say about it is it's not going to cost more than what we're doing today. And if it's going to cost the same, it better have a clinical impact that is really meaningful.
Put a little bit more definition around significant, like significant improvement in cost or significant improvement in care. What is that?
Eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
And one thing, somewhere on here, I have the bullet point that statistically significant is not necessarily clinically relevant. Okay? So just because you have something that you can put through a clinical trial and say it works better, that's not good enough anymore. There's this term, clinically relevant. Sometimes societies define what clinically relevant means for a particular disease state. And so they'll say something like, in osteoarthritis, we need to see a 20% reduction in a certain type of pain measurement, call it clinically relevant. Sometimes the payers do that. An insurance company will say, great, you got a new product you want me to pay for, but to be honest, it's only 15% better than what we're paying for today, so no, we're not going to pay for it. Okay, so it's very subjective. And again, just because something is statistically significant doesn't mean it's meaningful.
But from a time perspective, at what point do payers consider time saving within a hospital to
It's a
be
tough thing.
significant?
Yeah, so if you're talking about something like operating room time, it's really hard to get hospitals to buy into that. We're going to save you 60 minutes a day, you're going to get to do another 2 procedures, you're going to make a bunch more money. I've never seen that work with a hospital. If you tell an insurance company that you're going to save them money over 3 years, they don't care at all. Okay, and we're going to talk about stakeholders in a little while, and we'll talk about why that's the case and how it's different for each stakeholder. Okay? This goes right to your point. ACL Technologies, ACL Repair Technologies. As an investor, I've seen a million of these things. And what they always say is, we're going to reduce the failure rate of ACL constructions, maybe by as much as 50%. That sounds pretty damn significant, right? Except for it's really not a big problem to start with. That's the issue here. So if a procedure has a 30% failure rate, or a resurgery rate because the device fails, 50%, that's a lot. But if something is only failing at the rate of 4%, dropping it down to 2%, that's not terribly exciting to most investors or large companies. Who can tell me why that's not very exciting? Because if you're one of the failures, you care, right? But why do companies hate to see this stuff? And investors. It's just bad investing.
So marginal, maybe difference.
Probably not going to make much of a difference. Yeah, it's better, but, doesn't really matter. There's another problem with this, too.
Possible?
Why does it cost, what costs more?
It takes longer to get your money back.
It does, if you ever get there. And the reason is that if something is only failing at a rate of 4% and you're trying to drop it down to 2%, you know what your clinical trial is going to look like? That's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. It's going to be thousands of patients. Well, there's only 7,000 of these procedures done a year. Total. Okay, so if you got to run a clinical trial that's thousands of patients, you got to basically capture them all in the whole country every day. It's an impossible clinical trial. That's the big problem, is you can never even get to the therapy because the incidence is how often something happens per year, is too low. And you're trying to get too much, this is called an effect squeeze, an efficacy squeeze, where it's already really good and you're trying to get it just a little bit better. Statistically, it's a very difficult clinical trial to do. Okay? So we want to address large problems that involve a high number of patients where the clinical trial is doable because there's enough patients to recruit from. We can do it. We can, get to statistical significance without having to treat the whole country.
Does that mean that some of these inventions, we'll never get to a point where it's improved? I mean, you get to a
point where it's just so.
That's
good
why
enough
a
that
lot
it
of
just
orthopedic devices, really don't improve that much. And it's because the clinical trials are just very difficult to enroll. If you're getting a failure rate that's 4%, which a lot of these procedures are, most would say it's good enough. How much better do you want to get? And if you want to drop it by 50% and get down to 2%, that is a ton of patients.
Does that change if it goes from ACL reconstructions to death or something like that? You're able to save more lives or something along those lines?
It can, there's lots of things that we can do to save more lives, and we just don't because it's not worth the investment. So, not for everything. We could save a lot of lives, but we choose not to because it's not worth the cost. It's got to make money, and you got to be able to get there. Claims have to be demonstrable. You can't say stuff about a medical product like, well, it's going to improve outcomes. Okay? Maybe. How are you going to prove it? What's the experiment? If you had all the money in the world, what would the experiment be that you prove what you're saying here? Because it's not worth much until you can prove it. If something is not demonstrable, if a claim is not demonstrable, how am I going to market that? What am I going to tell doctors? Yeah, you'll get a better result, don't worry. They're not going to buy that. So if you say something about something, you need to be able to back it up, or at least say how you're going to get to that point. You need to be able to design the experiment that is going to prove it out. Is it going to be lower cost? Prove it to me. Why is it going to be lower cost? How is it going to be lower cost? Make a few of them and convince me that you have a manufacturing process that actually does lower cost. Or that using an app on your phone is going to decrease the cost of caring for a diabetic patient. See it all the time. We got an app and it's going to monitor the patient, let them know, they have to punch in at what they've eaten. It's going to tell them that they've eaten too much sugar and they haven't taken their glucose or their glycogen inhibitors, whatever they're taking. Prove to me that having an app is going to reduce the cost of caring for that patient. If you say you're going to do it, you're going to have to see it. So make sure whatever you say, especially to an investor or a large company, you can actually prove it. And there's that statistically significant doesn't mean that something is relevant. Okay. Okay, claims of cost savings. Another point on this. Must occur in a time frame that's relevant to the payer. Okay? So if you look at, say, an insurance company, their typical customer isn't going to last more than about 18 months, 2 years. That's about how long they're going to hold on to that customer. So if you say, well, we're going to control diabetic patients better, and we're going to better monitor their insulin administration, and they're going to be healthier. But you're not going to see the savings from that, Mr. Insurance Company, for another 3 years, because it takes that long. They're not going to care. And the reason is that's going to be somebody else's patient 3 years from now. So if you're pitching that something's going to save money to an insurance company, it's got to be within the window that they care about, which is 12 to 18 months. What are you going to save me this year on that patient? Outside of that, it's somebody else's patient. You're helping my competitors by saving money on that patient 4 years down. But if you look at somebody like Medicare, everybody know what CMS is? Center for Medicare, Medicaid Services. They take care of all the old people in our country. Sorry, Rob. You brought up the UNC.
Paybacks are hell.
Yeah. If they're taking care of somebody between the ages of, where's it start? 55? 60? I don't even know, 60?
65.
90? They have a payoff period that looks much different, right? They're a lot different from an insurance company. Okay? So you can make the pitch to them that we're going to save you money over the next 5 years in your patient population. But always keep the payer in mind. If the payer is a private payer, an insurance company, they don't have that time horizon. So just make sure that what you tell them is relevant to them. Any questions on claims? Now, don't get confused by claims like what you tell the FDA you're going to do. This is just claims of what you're telling investors, people who would put money into this. When you tell the FDA what your claims are, that's what's going to go on the label of your product. That's not what we're talking about here. Addressable market, something that is super simple but often misused or misunderstood. Anybody want to tell me what addressable market means? Did I put it up there? No?
It's per unit times
Just
the
turned
number of
into a
units
reading
per
test.
year.
Okay. So it's really, really simple. The addressable market is the dollar amount per purchase times the number of purchases per year. It's an annual thing. So if we say that I'm going to sell 100 of those pills a year at $1 a pill, the addressable market is $100. Okay? Addressable market is very important to investors and companies because it's going to take them a lot of money to get this stuff into a patient and to get FDA approval or to get it out into the marketplace. How much? It depends. Simple 510K. 510K is the easiest way to sell a medical product in the United States. It's the minimum of requirements by the FDA short of non-registering, which there are some stuff that are so simple they don't even get a 510K. But if you have to get a 510K from the FDA, you're probably not generating a lot of data because the product doesn't have a risk to humans. You're just going to put it out onto the marketplace. You're not making a lot of claims about what it can do for the patient. Nice and simple, no data, but you got to pay a regulatory person to get this through, to file all the paperwork and to get the approval from the FDA. It's not hugely expensive. If that's your path, then the amount of investment it takes to get there is fairly low. So we don't need to see a large market. Maybe around $100 million a year. Maybe a little bit lower. Maybe 50, maybe 75. None of these numbers are hard. They're to give you orders of magnitude. Now, if you have a 510K that's requiring some data that the FDA is going to want to see, things get more expensive. We have to run clinical trials. We have to back up the claims that we're going to put on our label. Hey, this cures cancer. That's a lot of money to get there. IDE PMA, in case you don't know what these are, investigational device exemption and pre-marketing approval. An IDE is what you get when you want to test a device in a human. In the United States, you can't put a medical device in a human without the FDA saying it's okay. Their okay is the IDE. After you run all your clinical trials, you file for a PMA, and that's the FDA's license to you to market your product. This is a very expensive pathway. This is a clinical trial, and some 510Ks with data are clinical trials. It's a lot of money to run clinical trials. Give you a perspective, generally $15,000 to $30,000 per patient for most clinical trials, and that's before you count in the drug costs or the device costs. So typical clinical trial, get to market, build up the company, $5 to $50 million to get there. A lot more investor money to get that product to the point where it's ready to sell. So we need to see a much larger market. That's then several $100 million. If you're really hardcore IDE PMA, where you're going to have one of these really expensive $50 million trials, investor may want to see $1 billion market for that, which is about the same as what they want to see for a drug. So IND NDA pathway is sort of the IDE PMA pathway, but for drugs. And this is investigational new drug. This is your license to go into humans. And then NDA, which is a new drug application. I just lost my audience. That's okay. So these trials, if you don't even count the failed ones, just the ones that worked, $100 million approximately to get a drug from day one all the way through the clinical trials and approved, and maybe a 7 to 10 year process to do that. So we got to see really big money in the market to do that. Now, this presupposes that you have a product that you're selling over and over and over again, right? Some people are working on products where their customer is something like a hospital. And you're going to sell them one thing, and then you're done. The way you think about the addressable market on something like that you know, let's say there's 10,000 hospitals in the United States, each one of them is only gonna buy one. But you can't do it all in 1 year. You can't get them all to buy your product all in 1 year. Maybe in the first year it's 1,000. Your addressable market is gonna be the number of hospitals that you could sell to in the first year. Then your second year market is gonna be some fraction of that, third year some fraction of that. It's not an annuity type of thing like we think of other products. A lot of products that are just gonna go to, you know, hospitals just gonna buy one, it becomes very difficult to view how an investor makes money on that. Because in the first year, maybe you're gonna sell 10 of them. And then those 10 hospitals are not gonna need to buy another one for 15 or 20 years, okay? So it's important to think about that as you're thinking about addressable market, you know, for these products where it's just one per customer and then they're done for the rest of their life. It's not like selling somebody a cure. Any questions on addressable market? Because this is something that gets screwed up a lot in the entrepreneurial world. People say, well, I got this, you know, I got a cure for cancer. Or I have a cure for a certain type of colon cancer. But when they talk to the investor, they say, well, cancer is a, you know, it's a $20 billion market. Yeah, it is, but that's not who you're selling to. You're selling to the patient with a very specific type of colon cancer. And so that's not your addressable market. Your addressable market is your therapy times the price you're going to charge for it. Okay?
So are you basically saying that within the market you're targeting, that this is 100% penetration of that market? So the patient pool you're looking at, we capture 100% of those?
Yeah, you're assuming 100%. So you're entering a playing field with competitors, and we want to know how big the playing field is.
So is this,
You'll make some assumptions about how much of that you can capture. And maybe, you know, it's 1% first year, 3% second year, 5% third year, sort of the typical growth rate that we see. But we don't know, we don't want to know what all cancers are worth, because that's not what you're selling into. Okay? Any questions on addressable market versus total market? No? Okay. Who cares? The people who care are the people who generally put in the money, whether it's to develop your product, people who benefit from it, people who prescribe it. But you need to be really conscious about who cares. These are your stakeholders, and you need to know a lot about them. You need to know everything about them. Okay? So I run a contact lens company. It's called Visioneering Technologies. And we sell contact lenses for people with a disease called presbyopia. Anybody know what presbyopia is?
that's for Ron.
Rob, can you tell us what presbyopia is?
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, I was hoping somebody would take me on it.
Everybody over the age of 40 will eventually get it.
Okay, I got progressive, so it's
Where you have to get your reading glasses.
All right, so over the age of about 40, 42, you will start losing, and I guarantee you this, I will bet you any amount of money if you want to take the bet, that you will start losing your ability to read up close. You'll start to have to hold things further and further away to be able to see them. And this is something that 100% of you will be affected by. There's no escaping this, and it's called presbyopia. Okay, it's a massive market because everybody gets it who lives over the age of 40, 42, 45. We have developed a contact lens that if you have trouble seeing distance and you turn 40, 42 and you start losing that ability to see close, now you can't see anything, you can't see far away or near. But if you've been wearing contacts for your distance, our contacts will give you the ability to see distance and near at the same time. Completely transparent to you, it's just a regular floppy contact lens. Okay? Who would care about this? Who cares? Patients, right? Who else? Clinicians, doctors care, right? They don't have a great solution for these patients yet. They do have contact lenses for presbyopes, but they're not very good. Who else?
Vendors are going to be selling your contacts.
Sure. We got distributors, right? Distributors are going to be selling it. Our company sells them.
Vendors selling reading glasses, we care.
Competitors, absolutely they care. They get very upset by this stuff. Competitors, doctors, patients, distributors, who else? Investors care, right? They put the money in to get us here. We've raised close to $20 million. We raised close to 20 million before we sold our first product. That money's got to come from somewhere, and it's a bunch of money. They care a lot. Who else cares? Everybody.
Everybody.
Yeah.
FDA.
FDA cares a whole bunch, right?
Yes.
Government cares a lot because we're making claims here. We're saying that we're going to give you up close vision and distance vision simultaneously. And we can't say that without the FDA telling us that we can say that, right? So the FDA cares a lot, right? These are called our stakeholders, and understanding them and understanding what they care about is hugely important very early in the process. Oops. Okay? So at Visionary, when we first put the money in, how do we stop there? Well, let's just talk through it. So at Visionary, when we first put the money in, we made some assumptions. We talked to a few stakeholders. We talked to doctors. We said, you know, what's the problem with the current multifocal, bifocal contact lenses? Well, the patients don't like them because they can't see. Okay. Well, we're going to solve that problem for you. You ask the patients, why don't you like the bifocal contact lenses that your doctor gave you? Because he can't see. And especially, I can't see up close. And that was the problem I went into the doctor with. So the current bifocal contact lenses generally don't solve the near vision need of patients. So if you were a visionary, what would you do? You develop a lens that what?
Solves that problem.
Solves the problem, right? Easy. You develop it, you run a bunch of clinical trials, spend a lot of money, and you go back out to the doctor. And you say, hey doc, we solved your problem. We got a lens here that is going to solve that need for simultaneous near and distance vision. The same doctor you went to 3 years ago and $15 million ago. And he says, I don't care. Doesn't matter. That's great. You solved the problem that my patient has. Primary complaint, can't see near. Doesn't really matter to me. Well, that sucks, right? We just spent all that money. We just developed this contact lens. We just ran a clinical trial. We gave you the output, and now you're telling us you don't care. Why doesn't that doctor care?
So they're gonna sell a contact lens.
They're going to sell it anyways. They can sell something that works better, but you're on the right track.
Doesn't affect the bottom line.
It's actually no effect on its bottom line. Okay? And it has to do with market dynamics in the contact lens industry. So it turns out that that stakeholder has a problem he didn't tell us because he doesn't want to look like he's motivated by money. Doctors are, you know, they're earning a living just like everybody else. We're not in a socialized medical system like Canada or Great Britain. Doctors need to make money in this country, and they make money selling products. Well, for an eye doctor, for an optometrist, the way contact lenses work is you go in, they figure out what contact lens is going to work for you, and then they give you a prescription. They say, hey, we carry this in my office. We'll be happy to sell them to you. But you're a smart consumer. You've been on the internet. And you're going to go on 1-800-CONTACTS or contacts.com, and you're going to buy those contact lenses. And the doctor's going to make nothing from them. Not only is the doctor going to make nothing from it, but bifocal contact lenses are very difficult to get fit into patients. It takes about 3 visits, each visit being about 30 minutes. The doctor gets paid for the first visit, and that's it. The patient doesn't pay for the second and third visit. Doctor loses money on the fitting of the bifocal contact lens. Then the patient turns around and goes buys the lenses online. The doctor doesn't make any money on the contacts themselves. So while we have solved the medical problem, we didn't solve the problem of the gatekeeper, which is the optometrist. It turns out that they hate how long it takes to fit these patients in these contact lenses, which they didn't tell you because it's embarrassing to them that they fail so many times. Even after 3 visits, they only get about 67% of their patients accepting the contact lens. The rest of them just decide to go back to glasses or other modes like modified monovision. So the doctor loses money on a patient fitting. They don't make any money on the contacts. The patients don't like the lenses, you know, the ones that exist, but they never get to see ours or anybody else's because the doctor's not happy about this other stuff. So, how do we solve that problem? The design of our lenses is really different from the way the other bifocal contact lenses are made. And the design is such that it makes it super easy for the doctor to fit our lenses to patients and get them to accept them. One visit, 20 minutes, done. Well, we didn't run a trial to show that. Had we known that that was the important thing, we would have put that into our marketing claims, and we would have ran a clinical trial that purposefully tracked that stuff. Well, fortunately for us, just as part of our data collection, we did track it. We were able to go back to the doctors and say, okay, now we understand your real problem. Our average patient is fit 90% of them in one visit, 20 minutes. Do you like that? Love it. Now you're solving a problem for me, okay? The other problem is that they lose the patient to online retailers like 1-800-CONTACTS. There are 4 major contact lens companies in the United States. About 18 years ago, they were caught colluding on price. They all got together, they sat in a room and they said, what are you gonna charge? All right, well, I'll charge the same thing and I promise. And this is called price collusion, and it's illegal in the United States to do that, okay? It's called anti-competitive. The Federal Trade Commission gets very upset when they see this happening. These 4 companies were caught and entered what's called a consent decree, where in order to limit the fines that they had to pay for acting illegally, they had to agree to something with the government. The government said, okay, what we're going to do here is you're going to have to sell to online retailers and compete with them on price. That way we have a marketplace of pricing pressures that is more fair to the consumer. And so by law, they all have to sell through online retailers. They can also sell directly to the doctor, but then that doctor ends up competing with the online retailers. Doctor can't do that. Most eye doctors are small private practices, 1 or 2 owners. They can't compete with 1-800-CONTACTS, which is like the Amazon of contact lenses. And so we have a very unique position in the contact lens industry. We're not required to sell online because we didn't exist when that settlement was done. So we don't have to sell online. We can sell directly to the doctor. Well, guess what matters more to an eye doctor than the patient? Making money selling lenses to the patient, okay? Personally, I think we could have had mediocre vision in our product and really not have solved the problem, and they would still love us, because they don't have to send their patient to the online retailers. They make money selling our lenses. But we also solve the other problem for them, which is we get really high acceptance rates and very quick fittings in their office. So they make money on the fitting, then they turn around and make money on the lenses themselves. So we solved a problem almost by accident because we didn't do enough stakeholder analysis at the very beginning. We didn't ask the right questions. If you ask a doctor a question like, hey, aren't these multifocal, bifocal contact lenses out there, aren't they terrible? Wouldn't you like to have better ones? Of course. They're going to say yes. You know, they're not going to say no, I don't care about the patient. But if you ask the question, you don't prescribe a lot of bifocal contacts, why not? You get a very different answer. Especially if you take them out for a few drinks, you buy them a couple of dinners, you're going to get a different answer from sitting in their office and saying, why don't you do this? You know, you're going to drag that answer out of them that is, yeah. Look, the problem is that I don't make any money on these things. And not only do I not make any money, they take up too much of my time. And once they go to an online retailer, I lose about half of them. They don't come back to me because they buy a year's worth of lenses, they forget about me, and they go to a different doctor. So there's a patient retention problem when patients go online to buy their lenses. And we solve that because a patient can only buy our lenses directly from the doctor who prescribed them. And we can't get in trouble for not selling online because we didn't get caught cheating, including on price. So it's super important to talk to as many stakeholders as you can and ask the right questions. Payers for us are not really an issue. The insurance companies generally don't pay for contact, so it's not very important to us. But we have a distributor, we have a manufacturer, we have to deal with the FDA, and I have investors who call me every day. And these are my stakeholders, and I talk to them a lot. So don't just talk to one, and when you do, don't try to get out of them what you want to hear. Okay, because often the reasons for behavior patterns in medicine are not what you expect. Does that make sense? Well, who pays? Let's talk about some of these payers and why they care. So, Aetna, private insurance company, right? We talked about them. Why you don't want to go to them and say, hey, I'm going to reduce your healthcare costs on a diabetic patient in the next 5 years. They don't care. But CMS would care a lot, right? Very different message to them. Department of Veterans Affairs, they have a very specific patient group suffering from a very specific set of ailments, okay? The Department of Veterans Affairs is one of the largest single-payer health systems in the world, as is Medicare, Medicaid, okay? They're also, it turns out, to go back to the very first point we made about the cost of healthcare, this is a single-payer system, and this is a single-payer system, right? It's an entire contained healthcare system with one payer. Their cost of providing care is about a third of what it is in the general population of the United States, 70% cheaper, okay? Cheaper than even Germany, cheaper than Cuba. So single-payer systems do have an advantage. You just have to keep in mind that they have very specific patient populations. If you look at CMS, they're all over the age of 55 or 65, right? So you're not going to go to CMS and start talking about payment for something that only affects people that are 25. So you always have to keep your payer in mind. You used to not talk to the private insurance companies about young people because young people tended to be uninsured. They're insured at a much higher rate now, which provides some opportunity to talk to these insurance companies about things that we didn't really talk to them before. So the payers are your stakeholders. Any question? Barriers to entry. Okay. So if I'm an investor, let's take my investors. We talked a little bit about this before. Put in almost $20 million into me launching a contact lens product. That's a lot of money. They want that money back. And they want multiples of it back. So I have to make them a lot of money. Right now, our product is patented. Nobody else can sell our contact lenses. Nobody else can use this channel that we use. So we control pricing. I don't fight with the other contact lens companies on price. I can charge much higher than they do because I'm providing a benefit. Nor can they take my contact lens design, copy it, and put it onto the market until my patent expires. Why is that important? I don't have to compete with them. I'm not competing on price. But as soon as they can do what I do, as soon as they can make these lenses, as soon as they know the secret sauce, they can just go out and copy it. And if it's no longer patented, they'll compete on price. And once I start competing on price, you know how economics works, the price is going to come down to something that is just barely profitable. Because that's how supply and demand work with non-patented products. If I had to do that right now, I'd never be able to pay my investors back. I couldn't sell enough lenses to pay them back. And so investors will typically require, and certainly large companies will require, that if they're going to fund something for you, or if they're going to buy a product from you, that it's patented. A lot of people say, well, I didn't patent it, but it's a trade secret. That's not worth much. Okay? People will figure out how you do things. Right now, yeah, we're patented, but our design is also a trade secret. We don't disclose in a patent how we do this, except for very broadly. People could reverse engineer it in a few years when the technology becomes available. You picture a wet floppy contact lens, it's really hard to reverse engineer the optics that's in one of those, so they can't quite do it yet, but they'll be able to eventually. That trade secret won't last 2 days after our patent expires. They will figure it out like that. They'll put the money into it and they'll figure it out. It's a Trade secret, generally not worth much. Patents, almost always a requirement in order to get the investment that it takes to get a medical product out where it's actually helping patients. Any questions on that? Nope. Just one thing interesting to know about venture capitalists. They're not going to look at your patents until it's the very last thing that's on their plate to do for you. They're going to do everything else first. And the reason for that is that they have to spend money on patents. Once they start looking at your patents, they get a patent attorney involved. They're paying $500, $600 an hour for one of these people. They don't want to do that unless everything else checks out. A company, on the other hand, has patent attorneys on salary that they keep on staff. And they like to keep them busy. So it's generally the first thing a large company will look at. They also want to know, a large company, something to know about large companies. The very first thing they do if you show them one of your products is they go to their engineers and they say, can you design around this? Or do I have to buy it? And it's their first approach generally to medical devices and sometimes drugs. They get the patent guy together with the engineer and say, find a way around this. And you don't hear from them for a few weeks. They get really quiet as they try to figure this out. They'll tell you they're busy at a conference I'd go to. Been pretty tied up, sorry to take so long. Really what they're doing is they got their engineers trying to figure out how to work around your patents. Because they're not going to buy something if they can just get around your patents and make it. And always keep that in mind about medical device companies especially. Maybe Tech Transfer's had a different experience with them, but I haven't. And I first learned of this from a friend of mine who worked at a spine company called Medtronic. Maybe you've heard of them. And he was an engineer at Medtronic. Started off as a biomedical engineer, worked his way up. Actually had a company called Danik, which got bought by another company called Softmore. Eventually Medtronic, Softmore, Danik became their spine division. He was an engineer there and ultimately worked in their technology, outside technology evaluations group, which is a euphemism for design around group. Because that's what they do. They sit around and try to figure out how to get around devices that have been shown to them that they figure we can, much cheaper than buying this, we can just design it ourselves. And not until they've made the decision we can't get around the patent do they say, okay, let's buy it. Okay. Takeaways. You can agree with it or disagree with it, but in order for medical products in the United States to ultimately benefit the patients we really want to help, it has to make money. And it has to make a lot of money because getting these products to market, clinical trials are just unbelievably expensive, and the only thing that even compares in cost to a clinical trial is building a sales force to sell the stuff. Hugely, hugely expensive endeavor. So you got to make a lot of money or nobody's going to put in the large investment that it takes to get there. It will have to have a large market that is protected by intellectual property. It has to have a customer who's willing to pay, and you need to be talking to that customer way before you design the product, because ultimately you care about what the person with the money says. And these days, no more Me Too products. You have to significantly reduce the cost of treating the patient, or you have to significantly improve the outcome that they expect to experience. And generally, both, which is super hard to do. Now, we certainly don't do that with our contact methods. We charge more for them because we can.
On that note, when you do get acquired or you're planning on getting acquired by a contact manufacturer, does that change the channel for them since they can no longer go direct to doctors, since it was probably one of the big four?
It's a good question, because it's part of our value, right? Other than it adds the design, the performance. So if they came out and just totally bought us, yes. More likely, what they would do is they would leave us set up as a subsidiary, not subject to the agreement that they made with the Justice Department. They buy 19% of us. They wouldn't consolidate the financials. At least if I were there, that's what I would do. So I'm going to buy 19% of you, but as soon as you hit 20%, you consolidate financials and it becomes your baby. And once they do that, we would be subject to their rules. We would lose that. One other thing that we didn't talk about in